When Caroline picked up the phone and asked her son Daniel about his wedding date, she never imagined the answer would hit her like a bucket of cold water. "Mom, we got married yesterday. We only invited special people." Those words made her legs feel weak, her hands trembling as she struggled to believe what she had just heard. Special people? Who were they? The answer made her feel like she was nothing at all, even though, for the past 3 years, she had devoted herself to caring for Daniel and Sarah, helping them with everything from paying their rent to buying household items, even selling her own precious keepsakes just to make ends meet for them. She stood there motionless in the middle of her living room, like a ghost in her own home. Her eyes turned to Sarah, the daughter-in-law she once believed was family, but now Sarah's gaze was cold, laced with mockery, as if Caroline were nothing more than an outsider. Daniel, her only son, avoided his mother's eyes, unable to face her the way he once had. Inside Caroline, anger and disappointment surged fiercely. How could this be? How could they get married without her by their side? How could they cast aside everything she had done for them? Her hands clenched tightly as a heavy sigh escaped her. She had spent 3 years caring for them, doing everything she could to ensure they lived comfortably, and now she was treated as if she were unnecessary. The feeling of being discarded and disrespected became sharper with every passing second. She had prepared everything for this wedding, from the pale pink dress she had chosen, hoping to look beautiful in her son's wedding photos, to the wedding gifts she had poured her heart into, all of it now meaningless. She had believed she would stand beside her son on his most important day, but instead she was an outsider, pushed aside despite everything she had done for them. Caroline slowly sat down, a tightness rising in her throat. She tried to breathe evenly but could not, as if something were lodged inside her chest. Her eyes drifted to the wedding dress she had bought for Sarah, still hanging quietly in the wardrobe, a silent reminder of the illusions she had nurtured for so long. The wedding gift she had prepared, the money she had carefully saved to give them, all of it had become useless, stripped of any value. A wave of humiliation, sorrow, and disappointment crashed over her like a violent tide. Only then did Daniel lift his head, his face filled with guilt, yet trying to speak steadily. "Mom, it was just a small ceremony, only us and a few witnesses." Caroline knew immediately that it was a lie. The photos she had seen on social media told the whole story. She saw Sarah in a pure white wedding gown, surrounded by her family and close relatives, all smiling and celebrating, while she had not been invited. Caroline sat there staring at her phone, her heart hollow. She felt like a stranger in her own life. She had sacrificed so much for them, and now this was how they treated her. The months without gratitude, without appreciation, now stood clearly before her eyes. A week passed, yet the sadness lingered. She could not forget Sarah's words, "We only invited special people." Those words did not just wound her heart, they exposed a truth she had long refused to face. A week later, Sarah called Caroline again, but her tone was completely different. This time, there was no pride or challenge, only pleading. She said the rent was due and they could not afford to pay it. Caroline remained silent for a few seconds, listening without interruption. Yet inside, she felt a numb ache, as though she had been deceived for 3 years. She had once run everywhere, trying to gather money to help them, even using her own savings. She had given up trips, personal interests, and simple joys just to support their household. Yet she had been cast out of her own son's most important day. And now they could call her asking for help, as if nothing had happened. Caroline took a deep breath and finally replied, her voice cold and without emotion. "Lena, did I not once say that I only help special people?" Silence followed. Sarah did not respond immediately. Caroline could hear her own heartbeat pounding clearly in her ears. She was not trembling at all, but it was Sarah who was shaking. Caroline received no explanation from Sarah, only a long, lingering silence on the other end of the phone. In that moment, it felt as though an invisible weight was pressing down on her heart, making it hard to breathe. The pleas and requests for help she had heard from Sarah before now felt like a cold attack. She had given them too much, sacrificed too much, yet they had treated her like nothing more than a money printing machine. The blow did not come only from being excluded from her son's wedding day, but also from the realization that they continued to take advantage of her kindness without the slightest gratitude. She understood that Sarah had not called simply to mention the rent. They truly had no other option left. In Caroline's mind, images replayed of the years she had spent living in loneliness, with no one by her side except for phone calls asking for help from her son and daughter-in-law, repeating like a cycle she could never escape. She had done everything, and once they had what they needed, they discarded her like something that had lost its value. In that moment, Caroline realized something important, perhaps the greatest awakening of her life. For too long, she had lived for others and forgotten herself. She had poured all her energy into caring for them, yet had never given anything to herself. She looked down at the phone, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. Things were no longer the same. What she had done for their family was no longer an obligation. It had become a painful lesson. She took a deep breath and allowed those emotions to pass through her. This feeling was not weakness or cowardice. It was a powerful shift in her thinking. "Enough," she whispered. This time, nothing would force her to endure any longer. Sarah's words still echoed in her mind. "We only invited special people." That sentence had once felt like a bucket of cold water poured over her, but now it was like a mirror reflecting a truth she had long refused to see. She was not special in their eyes, not important in their lives, perhaps not even a part of her son's life anymore. And yet, to Caroline, that was no longer the issue. What mattered was that she had realized she deserved love and respect. The next morning, Caroline sat in her living room, gazing out at the garden through the window. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows across the floor. She felt a sense of peace within herself, the first true peace she had felt in a long time. She was no longer an endless provider of money, no longer someone trying to please her son and daughter-in-law through meaningless sacrifices. She remembered the many days she had gone out to pay their bills, the times she had run everywhere trying to do whatever she could to help them, never receiving gratitude or affection in return. Without realizing it, she had become a tool for them, something they could use and discard when no longer needed. But today, Caroline decided her life would change. She would not continue living that way. She would not keep sacrificing without receiving anything in return. She would live for herself. The days of being the caretaker and constant supporter were over. She would no longer allow her son and daughter-in-law to take advantage of her kindness again. After careful thought, Caroline decided to call an old friend, a lawyer she had known for years and trusted to help her in this situation. She did not want to remain a victim in this story. She did not want to let them continue to oppress her. She wanted to protect her rights, her freedom, and her independence. When the call ended, Caroline felt lighter. She was no longer alone in her decision. She no longer felt like an abandoned victim. She felt stronger, more confident in herself. The following day, she went to the bank and met with her account manager. She decided to change everything. No more automatic transfers each month, no more financial support for Max and Sarah. She wanted full control over her finances, not allowing anyone to interfere. Every decision about money would now be hers, and she would not let anyone manipulate her again. As she walked out of the bank, Caroline did not feel guilty. On the contrary, she felt as though a heavy burden had been lifted. For too long, she had lived for others. Now it was time to live for herself. She felt free, and that freedom was wonderful. She had the right to love herself, care for herself, and put herself first. She stepped outside, her footsteps lighter and more confident than ever before. For the first time in many years, Caroline felt as though she was living an entirely new life, one no longer bound by obligations and sacrifices that were never returned. She decided she would live the way she wanted, no longer subject to anyone's manipulation. Caroline stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, her hand gently touching the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, where the marks of years of sacrifice had begun to show. She looked at herself and, for the first time in many years, felt a strength she had never recognized before. In the reflection, there was something new, a confidence she had never known. She recalled the phone call from Sarah the day before, when she had calmly spoken words that could have left anyone stunned. She had refused to do anything more for them, refused to allow anyone to take advantage of her again. The feeling in that moment was indescribable, as if a lifelong burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. It was not merely a decision about money, it was about redefining her own worth, about claiming the right to be loved and respected without having to trade herself for it. For months, Caroline had lived too much for others. Day after day, she had gradually forgotten herself, forgotten the dreams and interests she had pushed aside. She had devoted all her time and energy to Max and Sarah, always believing her love would be repaid, that her sacrifices would one day be acknowledged. Instead, what she received was ingratitude and disrespect. She had fallen into the trap of giving without receiving anything in return. On long nights when she woke from restless sleep, tears would fall, not from sorrow, but from disappointment. She had believed love could buy everything, that if she was always present to meet their needs, they would love her more. In truth, she had only been a tool they used when necessary. She was exhausted by the calls asking for help, exhausted by the times they came to her only to demand something, while genuine care remained distant. She remembered clearly the moments she had canceled her own plans to rush to the bank and transfer money to Max, to Sarah, for whatever they needed. She had sacrificed her own peace just to provide for them, believing they would never make her feel meaningless. Yet in the end, she realized that her very sacrifices had made her invisible in their eyes. Then came the day Sarah called and said, "We are already married. We only invited special people." Those words were like a bucket of cold water thrown in her face, forcing her to stop pretending not to see the truth. She had spent years helping them, countless times forgetting herself for their sake, and now, when she wished to be part of her son's most important day, she was not even invited. The pain was beyond words, but instead of continuing to feel ashamed, Caroline sensed a profound shift within her soul. She had awakened. She no longer saw herself as the loser in this story. She was no longer someone begging for love from people who did not value her. She understood that life was not meant to be an endless chain of caring for others while neglecting herself. Caroline decided she deserved to live the way she wanted. She began changing habits that had defined her for years. The first step was calling a lawyer she had known for a long time, someone who could help her protect her assets and her rights. She was no longer worried about what Max and Sarah might say or demand, because she knew she had the authority to decide her own life. She also learned how to safeguard her finances, ensuring no one could interfere again. She no longer felt guilty or anxious when refusing requests from her son and daughter-in-law. For the first time in years, Caroline was living for herself. She began taking better care of herself, rediscovering interests she had long abandoned, and participating in activities she once loved but never had the chance to pursue. She enrolled in painting classes, a passion she had previously set aside to focus on family. She no longer felt the need to please anyone, especially those who had failed to appreciate what she had done for them. One day, Caroline decided to visit her husband's grave, a journey she had postponed for so long because she was always busy with Max and Sarah. She went to Robert's grave, sat beside it, and spoke to him as if he were still there. Her words were not complaints, but an acknowledgement that she had lost much over the years. Yet now, she had found herself again. When she returned home, the sense of relief was indescribable. She no longer felt fear. The cars parked outside her house, the endless calls from Max and Sarah, no longer unsettled her. Caroline understood that this was the moment to stand up and protect herself. She had lived too long trying to satisfy them. Now it was time to live for herself. Caroline had regained peace within her soul, and that was the greatest victory she could achieve. She stepped outside confident, strong, and decisive. From this moment on, she would be the one in control of her own life. Caroline sat quietly in her living room, her hand wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The past months had moved to a rhythm entirely different from before. She was no longer rushing to respond to Max and Sarah's demands. She had stopped, looked back at herself, and realized that only by no longer living for others could she truly begin to care for herself. Since the day she decided to end the financial support for her son and daughter-in-law, Everything seemed to shift. She no longer felt guilty when she refused, no longer listened to complaints or insincere apologies. Instead, she felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. None of it had been her fault, and she no longer needed to carry the blame from people who never truly understood her sacrifices. Yesterday, Max called again. This time, it was not gentle words, not questions about money or requests for continued support. There was something different in his voice. She sensed immediately that this was not an ordinary call. "Mom, we need to talk," Max said, his tone no longer pleading but edged with irritation and anger. Caroline looked at the phone, her heart steady and cold. She knew everything had its reason. She had prepared herself for this moment long ago. She no longer felt afraid of demands or even threats. "Mom, there have been misunderstandings lately, but you cannot do this to your family," Max continued, his anger clear, yet Caroline simply exhaled without hesitation. She remembered the times Max and Sarah had promised she would never feel alone, that family was always the most important thing. Now, after everything that had happened, she understood. Those words had only been empty promises spoken to maintain her dependence on them. She could not deny the surge of indignation rising within her. She had sacrificed everything to keep the family secure, only to receive contempt and exploitation in return. With a quiet sigh, Caroline ended the call. Nothing had changed. There was no apology, no sign of regret, only cold words as if she were merely a tool. She felt a sense of emptiness, yet it was not entirely disappointment. It was like a door closing, and at the same time, another opening. Caroline began to question whether she had been too tolerant, too patient with those who had taken advantage of her for so long. She had given too easily without considering herself, chasing after affection and concern that had never been genuine. Max's accusations and Sarah's threats only strengthened her resolve. She had chosen a different path, one no longer bound by unreasonable demands or endless expectations. She wondered if she could finally live happily without sacrificing herself. A week passed without another call from Max or Sarah. Each night she slept peacefully, free from worry about them. She began to feel the difference clearly. The hours she once devoted entirely to others were now hers. She read books, studied painting, and did the things she had long neglected. She rediscovered joy in quiet moments, free from financial anxiety and free from the unreasonable expectations of those who never appreciated her. Then one afternoon, as Caroline sat in the park enjoying the gentle sunlight, a familiar face appeared before her. It was Eleanor, an old friend she had come to know during the months she began rediscovering herself. Eleanor smiled, her eyes bright with warmth, and that alone filled Caroline with comfort. "Renate, I have seen the change in you, you know. You have truly found yourself again," Eleanor said softly, her voice sincere. Caroline met her gaze and felt with certainty that she was no longer the fragile woman who endured everything for others. She had become strong, someone who knew how to stand up and protect herself. "Thank you," Caroline whispered. "I know it took me a long time to realize that I deserve love and respect without having to trade anything for it." Eleanor sat beside her, watching the sunlight slowly fade. They remained there together in silence, a silence that needed no words. Caroline understood that no matter how circumstances changed, she had reclaimed an essential part of herself that she had long forgotten. That was the first step toward living freely, without fear, without sacrificing herself, only to receive ingratitude in return. She was ready for whatever came next, and Caroline knew that no matter who entered or left her life, loving and protecting herself would always remain her highest priority. That day, Caroline stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring intently at her own reflection. The marks of time were etched deeply across her face, yet her eyes shone with a determination stronger than ever before. She was no longer the woman she used to be, always worrying about being accepted by others. She had gradually come to realize that when she let go of relationships that no longer brought value, she herself was the one who needed love and protection the most. A few days after deciding to end the financial support for Max and Sarah, Caroline clearly felt a shift within her soul. She no longer had to face deception, no more unexpected calls asking for money or fake apologies. Everything was now beyond her control, and within her rose a sense of freedom, as if she were no longer bound to anyone. In the first few days, she had felt confused, unsure of what she would do without being the financial provider for Max and Sarah, but now Caroline had rediscovered joy in the smallest things. She began revisiting the passions she had long forgotten. In the mornings, instead of rushing to take care of family matters, she spent time reading, listening to her favorite music, and sometimes walking in the nearby park. The world around her seemed more beautiful than ever, and she slowly realized she did not need to constantly help others in order to feel worthy. One morning, while sitting in a small cafe near her home, an unexpected call came through. This time, it was Sarah. But unlike before, Sarah's voice no longer carried anger or financial demands. Instead, it held weakness and a trace of anxiety. Sarah's voice trembled as she said they needed help. Caroline listened in silence, yet her heart no longer stirred as it once had. She had been ready for this moment for a long time. The coldness in Sarah's words, mixed with a hint of desperation, no longer made her feel guilty. Caroline gently replied that Sarah had once told her only special people would be invited to their wedding, so she could no longer help. She had decided she needed to help herself first. Her words were no longer rushed or fearful. They were firm and resolute, like a declaration that she had truly changed. On the other end of the line, Sarah fell silent. Caroline could sense the embarrassment in her daughter-in-law, who had once taken Caroline's financial support for granted. A few seconds passed, but Caroline remained calm, feeling no need to explain further. When Sarah said she did not understand, Caroline interrupted her firmly, telling her not to try to understand anymore. She had given them too much, and now it was time for her to live for herself. The call ended, and Caroline did not feel disappointed at all. Instead, she felt relieved, as though a heavy burden had finally been lifted. She did not allow threats or reproaches to shake her decision. In that very moment, she clearly felt that she still had control over her life, despite those who had once taken advantage of her. The next day, Caroline decided to visit some friends she had not seen in a long time. First, Clara, her close friend from university. Clara lived alone in a small apartment and had always understood her better than anyone. When Clara opened the door, Caroline did not need to say much. Her old friend looked at her and pulled her into a warm embrace. Clara smiled brightly and asked if she had finally done it. Caroline nodded, feeling joy rise within her. For the first time in years, she did not feel responsible for anyone else. She was simply caring for herself. She thanked Clara, her voice catching as she admitted she had never thought she could do it. But she had. They spent the entire afternoon talking, sipping tea, and sharing stories about the changes in their lives. These were the kinds of gatherings Caroline had missed for years, when every day had revolved around Max and Sarah, when she had lived only for them. Now she understood that sincere friendship like Clara's was what she needed more than anything. After saying goodbye to Clara, Caroline went to the local library to look for a drawing class. She had once loved art and creativity when she was young, but had given it up because of life's burdens. Now, without the constant worry about money, she decided to begin again. She enrolled in a basic drawing class, and although she knew she might never become an outstanding artist, that did not matter. What mattered was that she could live for herself, do what she loved, without sacrificing for anyone else. From that moment on, Caroline rediscovered herself, not through praise or recognition from others, but through the freedom she allowed herself to have. The change did not come solely from stopping financial support for Max and Sarah. It also came from the realization that she deserved to live happily, no longer as a shadow who only gave without receiving. As time passed, Caroline began living a life she had never imagined possible, a life without unconditional sacrifice, without exploitation, and she did not feel lonely, because she knew that when she loved herself, she would attract those who truly appreciated her, like Clara, and true friends who genuinely valued her. One morning, Caroline woke up with a strange feeling, as if everything around her had become new. She no longer opened her eyes with anxiety about pleasing others, no more phone calls from Max or Sarah, no endless demands for money. She had taken control of her life, and nothing could disturb the peace she had finally reclaimed. Each day now passed in a calm she had longed for over so many years. After deciding to end all financial support for Max and Sarah, Caroline no longer felt like someone being taken advantage of. Instead, she felt a strength rising within her, a source of power she had never known before. She walked to the park she often visited to relax. The trees were beginning to shed their leaves, autumn was approaching, and the cool air seemed to seep into every cell of her body. Everything felt fresh, just like her. As she stepped through the fallen leaves, her heart felt light as the breeze. She paused at a bench and looked up at the clouds drifting across the sky. No one was calling her. No one was asking her to do anything, and no one was watching her with expectation. In that moment, Caroline realized she no longer had to live for others. She did not need to try to be loved or to prove her worth. Her value already existed within her, without needing validation from anyone. In the months that followed, Caroline began to participate in more activities, doing things she had always wanted but never dared to try. She started learning to paint, joined yoga classes, and even traveled alone. She visited places she had always dreamed of seeing. These trips were no longer an escape from emotional exhaustion. They became journeys to rediscover herself, to connect with new friends, and to live according to what she truly wanted. One day, while sitting at an outdoor cafe with her favorite book in hand, Caroline received a call. This time, it was from Max. His voice sounded different, no longer angry or demanding like before, but hesitant, almost fragile. He said they needed to talk. Caroline remained silent, feeling no disturbance within her. She was ready for anything. She calmly asked what it was about, her voice steady, unwilling to let the call disrupt the peace she had worked so hard to build. Max hesitated, as if unsure what response he would receive. He admitted they were struggling and that what they had done to her had been a mistake. He acknowledged that she had helped them so much, and now he and Sarah finally understood. They wanted to invite her back into their lives, genuinely, not just financially, because she was an important part of the family. Caroline heard his words, but they did not soften her heart. This was not the first time Max had spoken with regret, and each time before she had felt used again. But this time she felt no weakness. She told him clearly and firmly that loving her was not a transaction. It was not something you did only when you needed her and ignored when you did not. There was a pause. Then Max spoke softly, saying they truly wanted to make things right, but she could not keep shutting them out forever. Caroline knew this was the moment to draw a final line. She had spent too many years living for them, sacrificing too much for a love that had never been complete. She did not want to remain part of a relationship built on dependence. She told him she could not continue living this way, that he and Sarah had grown accustomed to receiving only money from her. But now she needed to live for herself, not for him, not for anyone else. Max did not respond. Caroline sensed he understood, or at least would have to understand. The call ended, and her heart no longer felt heavy. Everything was clear, and there was nothing more she needed to do. In the days that followed, Caroline continued living in the peace she had found. She no longer worried that someone would demand something from her or take away what mattered. She was no longer the fragile woman she once had been. She was strong, independent, and ready to protect herself. The change within Caroline was not only about how she faced Max and Sarah, it was also about how she faced herself. She no longer waited for someone else's love to feel worthy. She had found her value in her own freedom. Caroline woke up with a strange feeling, not the familiar anxiety about unexpected calls or messages from Max and Sarah, but a sense of freedom. She realized she was no longer trapped in relationships drained of trust and hope. Instead, she felt as though she had just stepped out of a darkness that had lasted for years. Each morning, she no longer had to hear knocks at the door demanding help or listen to Max complain that she was not doing enough. There were no endless calls from Sarah, no judgment from anyone. She felt each heartbeat as if welcoming a new life. The decisions she had made in recent days seemed to have changed everything. She was no longer someone waiting for an apology or for Max and Sarah to change. She understood that what she had given over the past 3 years had not truly been love. It had been something closer to a transaction. And now she no longer wanted to live that way. One morning, Caroline sat by the window and looked outside. The scenery was no longer something she merely glanced at through glass. She felt connected to the world again, as if she had returned to herself. The feeling was wonderful, yet tinged with anxiety. Had she truly done the right thing? Was her decision a surrender of the most important things in life? She did not know, but she was ready to face whatever came. That day, while walking along familiar streets, Caroline paused in front of a small cafe. She stepped inside without any particular plan, simply wanting to enjoy a cup of coffee alone. As she relaxed, memories surfaced of the days she had devoted entirely to Max and Sarah, cleaning their house, worrying about them, doing everything she could to help. Endless calls to make sure they had enough money to cover debts, arguments she always tried to settle. She realized that everything she had done had been built on a mistaken ideal, that the love she offered had not been returned with sincerity. Holding her cup of coffee, Caroline felt a trace of sadness, but it was the sadness of release. The relief of no longer carrying responsibility for people who did not truly see her. She knew she could not change the past, but at least she had chosen not to let it control her life any longer. In the days that followed, Caroline continued living with new plans. She began attending art classes she had always wanted to try. She traveled to places she had never imagined visiting. She taught herself how to love who she was without seeking approval or acceptance from anyone else. One afternoon, while walking in the park, she met Eleanor, the friend she had made after cutting ties with Max and Sarah. Eleanor smiled when she saw her, her expression warm yet perceptive, as if she understood everything Caroline had been through. Eleanor gently remarked that Caroline had changed a great deal, that she looked healthier and happier, and that it was wonderful to see her this way. Caroline smiled, unable to hide her joy, and replied that she truly felt alive again. Eleanor asked if she had finally decided to live for herself. Caroline nodded and said she no longer had to live for anyone else. She had learned to love herself without waiting for recognition from others. Eleanor softly laughed and said that sometimes we have to lose something significant to recognize our own worth, that she too had cut off certain relationships in the past to find peace, and now she also felt free. Caroline looked into Eleanor's bright eyes and understood something profound. The freedom she had found was not an escape from responsibility or from life. It was a choice to live rightly, a choice to protect the peace within her own heart. She no longer saw herself as a victim of love or sacrifice. She was a woman with the right to decide her own life. They sat together on a bench, talking about simple things, about life and about the future. Caroline clearly felt she was no longer the fragile woman she once had been. She was strong, confident, and had learned how to live for herself. At last, she did not have to worry about those who had once taken advantage of her love. She felt a lightness she had never experienced before. When their conversation ended, Caroline stood up and thanked Eleanor for her sincere words. She walked away in an atmosphere filled with hope, a new hope she had never thought she would find again. She did not know what the future would bring, but she knew she would face it with strength, independence, and love for herself. Caroline opened the door and stepped into her small room, where warm yellow lights cast a gentle glow over everything around her. Everything seemed the same as before, yet she sensed a difference in the air, something unfamiliar yet undeniably freeing. This was no longer the place where she worried about unwanted phone calls, no longer the place where she felt responsible for helping Max and Sarah. She had completely cut ties with everything connected to them. And now she was alone with her decisions, alone to begin again. And yet, there was something different in what she felt. She did not truly feel lonely. The loneliness she had once feared when separating from the people she had devoted herself to had once been a deep pain. But now she was beginning to understand that she was not the one who had lost. She was not the one abandoned. It was Max and Sarah who had abandoned themselves, who no longer knew how to appreciate what she had done for them. Caroline sat down in the chair she had chosen when she first moved here, a soft green chair placed beside the window overlooking the garden. She felt the gentle sunlight pass through the glass and fall across the table where a cup of coffee had long gone cold. That cup had once been her companion every morning as she faced a life filled with tension. Now it was no longer something she used to escape her life, but something that allowed her to reflect on herself. She remembered the difficult days when she had been entangled in unhealthy relationships, when every decision she made was driven by the need to help, to please others. Max and Sarah had made her feel like nothing more than a tool, an endless source of money they could drain without hesitation. Those memories, she realized, had slowly eroded her patience and the love she had given them. But now everything had changed. Caroline was no longer the silent mother, grandmother, mother-in-law who endured everything quietly. She had found her own voice. She was no longer weak, waiting for recognition or apologies from people who did not truly care about her. She had chosen to step out of that cycle and rediscover herself. As she sat there in a new sense of calm and peace, she understood that she had truly changed. She was no longer haunted by calls from Max and Sarah. The times they phoned to ask for money or simply to check whether she was ready to help had faded into distant memories. She knew there was nothing more painful than living in a relationship where she was always the one sacrificing while others only took. There was no more self-pity, no more anguish over decisions her heart did not want to make. That day she decided to go out, not for any special reason, but simply because she wanted to. She no longer felt the need to prove her worth. She did not have to meet anyone or care for anyone. She only wanted to live for herself and enjoy the small things she had never had the chance to appreciate. As she stepped outside, she felt freedom in every movement. Each step was a firm affirmation of her choice. She no longer had to live for anyone else, only for herself. She wandered along the small street where shops were open and passersby smiled at her. The sense of freedom, of space untouched by obligation, made her feel at ease. She did not need to hurry anymore. There were no sudden calls to worry about, no demands waiting for her. She had learned to savor the present moment. Nothing was more important than living in the present, living in the peace she had reclaimed. Then, while walking along the lakeside, Caroline met Eleanor again, the friend she had met a few weeks earlier, the one who had witnessed her transformation. Eleanor saw her and offered a warm smile, saying she looked so different, healthier, and much happier. Caroline smiled in return, feeling truly alive again, and thanked her, saying she felt well, very different, as though she had found herself again. Eleanor's eyes reflected understanding as she replied that she knew that feeling, that there comes a moment when we realize we have sacrificed too much of ourselves for others until there is nothing left. Caroline nodded, finally giving voice to what she had kept silent for years, agreeing that now she no longer had to worry about anyone else and only wanted to live for herself. Eleanor responded that it was the best thing she could do for herself, that it was finally time to live, not to please anyone else. Hearing those words filled Caroline with relief. She had found herself again. She no longer needed to concern herself with people who failed to see her, no longer had to fear losing the false affection of those who did not truly care. She was herself, and that was what mattered most. This feeling, this freedom, was truly wonderful. Caroline woke up the next morning with a strange sensation. She no longer felt the need to check for missed calls from Max or Lena, no longer worried about unexpected financial requests appearing out of nowhere. She had decided to let go of everything that was not truly hers, to release responsibilities that had never really belonged to her. The feeling was like a fresh breeze moving through her life, bringing a freedom she had long desired. She rose from bed, stretched gently, and looked out the window. Outside was a beautiful spring morning, sunlight filtering softly through the lush green leaves in the yard, a peaceful scene she had never truly noticed before. In the past, every morning had begun with anxiety over things she could not control, but now she felt a clear shift in her mood. She felt lighter, freer, no longer burdened by calls, messages, or demands from Max and Lena. The people to whom she had given all her love and sacrifice were beginning to fade in her thoughts. She was no longer their financial provider, no longer a resource to be used. Caroline had found herself again. She went downstairs to the kitchen and brewed a cup of coffee, savoring each sip fully. For the first time in many years, she could do so without guilt. She did not have to fight for every minute of her time to give to others. she could devote it entirely to herself. The feeling was wonderful. After finishing her coffee, she decided to go outside, not for any particular purpose, but simply to breathe in the fresh air and enjoy her freedom. She walked along the neighborhood street, feeling each light step against the ground. The sense of being unbound made every step steadier. Passing the shops, she no longer felt obligated to spend her time tending to Max and Lena's needs. She did not have to shop for them or listen to urgent pleas for money. She had chosen her own path, free from unreasonable demands imposed by others. As she walked along the familiar road, she met Eleanor again, the new friend she had encountered weeks earlier, the one who had helped her so much during this time. Eleanor smiled warmly, her eyes filled with understanding and support, and remarked that Caroline looked different, healthier, and more confident. Caroline smiled back, feeling strengthened by the words, and replied that she felt very good, that she had found herself again, her voice filled with relief and freedom. Eleanor's gaze reflected deep understanding as she said she was glad to see the change, that sometimes loving ourselves means learning to set boundaries, and she believed Caroline had done the right thing. Caroline nodded, feeling her heart grow lighter. Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. Yes, she had learned that to love herself, she sometimes had to say no to those who did not deserve her sacrifices. She had spent too many years living for others, giving everything to relationships that ultimately led to exploitation. Now she understood she had to put herself first. She admitted that in recent days she had faced truths she once feared acknowledging, that she had lived her whole life trying to please others, but now she realized that without loving herself, she could never truly help anyone. Eleanor looked at her with empathy and said that sometimes we must let go in order to walk our own path, that Caroline had done the right thing and would live a wonderful life from now on. Caroline gazed into the distance where sunlight continued to shine and felt peace within. She no longer felt lost or abandoned. She had chosen a new road, one no one could alter for her. Eleanor reminded her she no longer had to worry, that she should live true to herself because that was what mattered most. Caroline thanked her from the bottom of her heart, feeling stronger than ever. This sense of freedom was what she had always longed for, and now she had found her way. As evening fell, she returned home, but this time she did not feel tired. She felt free, certain she had rediscovered herself. The things that once confined her no longer occupied her thoughts. She had left everything behind and moved forward with renewed faith. Caroline had discovered the most important truth in life: to love herself first. By doing so, she had not only freed herself from unhealthy relationships, but had also opened the door to a future filled with hope, freedom, and happiness. Caroline began to feel a profound change within herself. With each passing day, she grew stronger and more confident. The months of worrying about money, the calls from Max and Lena, had now faded into distant memories. She had decided to cut off all financial ties with them, and her heart was no longer burdened by unreasonable demands. Caroline's world now belonged to her alone. One beautiful morning, she stepped outside with a cup of coffee in her hand, sunlight streaming through the window and filling the space with warmth. She felt a sense of peace in her soul, something she had not experienced in a very long time. Even though everything was not completely settled, she knew she had made the right decision. Every step she took now reflected confidence and self-assurance. Today, she chose to do something she had postponed for far too long, to visit an old friend, Andrea. They had known each other for years, but because of family responsibilities, Caroline had not been able to see her often. Now, there was no reason not to do what she truly wanted. She called Andrea and arranged to meet at a familiar cafe. When she arrived, Caroline felt the calm and comfortable atmosphere. She sat down and looked around. The place was just as she remembered, a familiar space where she had once spent precious hours with Andrea. A little later, Andrea walked in with a radiant smile, and despite the time that had passed, that smile remained unchanged. Andrea greeted her warmly, saying how happy she was to see her again, her eyes shining with joy. Caroline felt a warmth in her heart. This was what she had neglected for so long, sincere relationships without calculation. She smiled and replied that she felt the same, that it had been a long time, They began to talk, simple conversations that somehow made Caroline feel as if she had rediscovered herself. Andrea asked about her recent life and everything she had been through. Caroline shared her decision to cut financial ties with Max and Lena and the sense of relief she felt after letting go. Andrea listened attentively, nodding from time to time, then told her she was proud of her for making such a strong decision. She said that people often believe pleasing others is love, but in truth, love begins with loving oneself. Caroline felt a gentle wave of emotion rise within her. Andrea's words were a reminder of something important she had long forgotten. She had spent too much time and energy loving those who did not appreciate her, placing others' needs above her own, and sacrificing far too much for people who did not deserve it. Caroline thanked her voice trembling slightly, admitting that she knew she had been wrong, but now she felt she had found herself again. She no longer felt the need to live to please anyone. She was living for herself. Andrea smiled warmly and said that was the most important realization, that happiness is not about giving everything away, but about knowing how to receive, and more importantly, knowing how to love oneself. They continued talking, yet deep inside, Caroline felt everything slowly returning to its rightful place. She had paused and reevaluated her life. She had spent so many years living for others, caring for people who did not value her. But now she no longer had to do that. She had reclaimed her power, the power to love herself and to live the life she desired. When the meeting came to an end, Caroline felt lighter. Today was not just a friendly conversation, it was an important milestone in her journey of change. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but at least she was no longer pulled by unreasonable demands or relationships built only on benefit. Stepping out of the cafe, Caroline took a deep breath and felt a freedom she had never known before. She looked around and realized that life was opening a new chapter, one she could truly control. No one could dictate her life anymore. No one could make her feel guilty for her decisions. She would live true to herself and never allow anyone to take advantage of her again. Caroline smiled and walked forward firmly on her own path. Caroline had prepared herself for the next battle, but this time she no longer felt fear or anxiety. After everything that had happened, she realized that in a relentless fight, the question was who was truly weak and who was truly strong. It was not those who believed they could control her through greed and manipulation. It was her, the one who had risen to reclaim her own power. That morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, Caroline sat at the dining table, her eyes fixed on the clock hanging on the wall. Everything was ready. She had prepared all the necessary documents to protect her rights in the lawsuit. This was no longer just a dispute about money. It was a battle to reclaim the dignity and respect she deserved. The call from Attorney Weber the day before had confirmed that Max and Lena's lawsuit was not merely about finances. They wanted control over her life. She had known it for a long time, but now the truth was no longer hidden behind lies. They did not simply want her to be an endless financial source. They wanted to break her independence, to turn her into a puppet unable to make her own decisions. Caroline could not allow that to happen. After years of enduring ingratitude, exploitation, and deception, she understood that what mattered most was not what others thought of her, but what she believed about herself. She stood up, took a deep breath, and put on the shirt she had kept in her closet, the one that had once symbolized her days as a mother, a wife, and a devoted woman. Today, it would symbolize strength, a woman who had rediscovered herself. Caroline knew that when she walked into the courtroom, she would no longer be the weak and patient mother she once was. When she arrived at the courthouse, she saw Max and Lena standing there, their faces unable to hide their anxiety. They did not look at her the way they used to. Instead of eyes filled with reproach, they now looked at her as if she were an enemy. But Caroline felt no pain. She no longer saw herself as the loser. As she stepped into the courtroom, she sensed the tension in the air. They were playing a high-stakes game, but she was ready to face every challenge. The arguments began, and as soon as Max presented his cunning claims, Caroline clearly felt the injustice in his words. He said his mother had changed, that she was no longer the mother he once loved. But she knew those words were merely a cover for ambition. Behind them lay the greed he and Lena had always concealed. When it was her turn to speak, Caroline stood firm, her eyes meeting the judge's without hesitation. She was no longer a woman intimidated by lies. She began recounting everything, from the sacrifices she had made for them to the difficult decisions she had taken to protect herself. Every word was strong and resolute, without a trace of trembling or fear. She was no longer weak. Yes, she had cut them off financially. She stated with confidence in every syllable, because she had realized that love is not something that can be bought or sold. She had spent too many years trying to please them, providing everything, yet she never received the love she deserved. They did not love her, they loved her money. The courtroom fell silent. Her words struck directly at the foundation of Max and Lena's arguments. They could no longer justify their actions. She was not only standing against them, but against everything they represented. They symbolized exploitation and selfishness, and she refused to be part of that game any longer. When the hearing ended, Caroline felt relieved, even though she was uncertain about the outcome. At least she had done what needed to be done. She had stood up for herself. She was no longer the woman who endured blindly out of love and sacrifice. She was strong, decisive, and fully aware of her own worth. As she left the courthouse, Caroline realized that whether Max and Lena won or not, they would never be able to take over her life. No matter how hard they tried, she had reclaimed her strength, and this time, no one could take that away from her. Caroline returned home in a strange state of mind, as if everything had changed overnight. She looked at her house, once a place of peace where she had endured so much pain and sacrifice. Now the feeling of control, of freedom, felt so unfamiliar that it almost frightened her. Everything she had done, every decision she had made, seemed like only the beginning of a long journey with no clear end. Earlier that day, when she walked out of the courthouse, her heart no longer ached. There was still a sense of unease, but she realized this was the turning point she had been waiting for all along. They might continue to pressure her, but she was no longer the frightened woman she used to be. She no longer had to endure the invisible weight of disrespect she had carried for years like a tattered coat. She had stood up for herself, and even if new challenges lay ahead, she knew she had found herself again. She stepped back into her home with a completely different mindset. It was no longer a place trapped in an endless cycle of sacrifice. For the first time in years, she did not feel guilty for doing something for herself. She had decided to stop supporting Max and Lena financially. That did not mean she had stopped loving them, but she understood now that love is not something to be bought with money or proven through unconditional sacrifice. It was a painful lesson, yet she had learned it. As she walked inside, her eyes fell on the old sofa where Max and Lena had sat so many times, asking for money, asking for help, asking for everything from her. Now it was no longer a place where she waited for them to return. She had chosen to completely cut off that financial tie. She could not continue living as someone who was used, someone who was loved only for material value. She had suffered enough and grown tired enough. Now she wanted to live for herself. All she needed to do was rediscover who she was. It would not be easy. She could not transform her life overnight, but she could begin with small steps and personal decisions. She knew that if she created space for herself, she would finally feel the freedom she had always sought. That evening, Caroline decided to go out to spend a day without thinking about Max and Lena, without worrying about them. For the first time in years, she felt she could do something just for herself. She walked along the street near her home, a road she had passed countless times without ever stopping. It felt both familiar and entirely new, like a path waiting to be explored. She sat at a small cafe by the roadside, where the warm glow of streetlights reflected gently on the water. She told herself that even if a long battle lay ahead, she had already accomplished something important. She had begun to love and respect herself. Part of her felt sadness for what had been lost, yet another part felt at peace. She had reevaluated everything and decided she would no longer allow herself to be deceived. She began doing things she had long been afraid to do. She called old friends she had neglected during the years she devoted herself to caring for Max and Lena. They welcomed her warmly. Their first conversation was not about family problems or the children she had sacrificed her life for. It was about Caroline, about what she liked, about interests she had pushed aside. They laughed and talked, and she felt as though she was stepping into a new chapter of her life. When she returned home, she sensed a strange calmness. The house that once carried constant tension and worry now felt different. She had created a safe space for herself. She began rearranging and cleaning her belongings, not to prepare for anyone else, but to renew herself. Each time she touched an old object, it felt as though she was letting go of a piece of the past, something that no longer fit the woman she was becoming. She opened the window to let the morning light pour into the room and sat down quietly. Caroline did not know what the coming days would bring. She did not know whether Max and Lena would stop or whether they would try again to seek help from her. But she knew one thing for certain: she would never again stand still and endure in silence. She had learned how to protect herself, and she would never allow anyone to take advantage of her love and sacrifice again. Caroline woke up the next morning and felt the stillness surrounding her home. The sense of peace she had been searching for all those years had finally arrived. She looked out the window, where the morning sunlight shimmered over the small garden she had spent so much time tending. Everything now seemed completely different. There was no more rush, no more worries about money, no more calls from Max and Lena asking for help. She was no longer a ship pulled helplessly by their waves. She was the one standing firmly on the shore, observing everything from a safe distance. With a cup of coffee in her hand, Caroline sat down in her favorite chair, the place where she once waited for them to appear, longing for attention, longing to be loved. Now, without the calls and the belated apologies, she realized she no longer needed to be saved by them. She had saved herself. Over the past months, her transformation had not come only from cutting financial ties with Max and Lena. It came from learning to listen to herself, from understanding that love is not something that can be bought with money. She had given up a part of herself for them, and now she was reclaiming what remained. Today, she decided to devote time to herself. In the past, she always felt guilty for doing anything just for her own sake, believing that if she did not dedicate all her time to Max and Lena, she would be an unworthy mother and grandmother. But today, she understood that she too deserved love and care. She chose to go alone to the park, a place she had not allowed herself to visit for years because she always felt responsible for worrying about her family. The long path in the park felt strangely unfamiliar. Everything around her seemed fresh and full of hope. Each step she took carried the weight of past memories, yet also a sense of pride because she had dared to stand up, dared to let go of a part of her life that no longer served her. She felt the gentle breeze brushing against her, and the restless waves inside her heart slowly calmed. She was beginning to learn how to live for herself. Sitting on a bench in the park, Caroline watched children playing and couples walking hand in hand, and she wondered whether she could rediscover joy in her own life as they seemed to have. She reflected on the years she had sacrificed unconditionally for others while forgetting herself. But now everything was different. She was no longer a woman who endured silently and gave without receiving. She had become stronger, someone who knew how to protect herself and love herself. That day, she did not only visit the park, she also decided to stop by a small bookstore she had always wanted to explore. It was one of the many things she had postponed for years because of family responsibilities. She stepped inside without a clear purpose, simply wanting to experience the freedom of doing something purely for herself. Shelves were filled with books of every genre, from romantic novels to self-improvement guides. Caroline moved slowly along the aisles, searching for a book that could soothe her soul and help her regain balance. In the end, she chose a book about meditation and mindfulness. She had heard about meditation before, but had never truly tried it. Holding the book in her hands felt like opening a new chapter in her life. Life did not always need to be rushed. She needed to learn to slow down, to feel each moment, and appreciate simple things. When she returned home, she began reading the book she had just purchased. The words flowed over her like a gentle wave, calming her mind and helping her understand that life does not always require a clear purpose. Living true to oneself, feeling and loving oneself, that was what truly mattered. She realized that no matter how many challenges lay ahead, she would never return to her old path. She would not allow anyone, not even her own children, to control her life again. A sense of freedom now filled her heart. She could go wherever she wished, do what she loved, without worrying or fearing that someone would demand something from her. She had learned that she herself was the most important person in her own life. That evening, as Caroline sat down to have dinner alone, she felt peaceful. Even if difficulties awaited her, she had learned how to live for herself. She had taken control of her life, something she had never imagined possible. With the changes within her, Caroline was no longer the weak woman she once had been. She was a strong woman who knew how to love and protect herself. Thank you for following Caroline's story. Each of us has the right to be loved and respected. And most importantly, we must learn how to love ourselves. Never let anyone make you feel unworthy. We have the power to change our lives, as long as we begin with small decisions each day. If you found this story inspiring and would like to share your thoughts, please do not hesitate to leave a comment below. I would truly love to hear your opinions about the lessons in life and how we can grow into the best version of ourselves. Please press like if this story meant something to you, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you will not miss other inspiring stories. Thank you for being here with me, and I hope we will meet again in the next stories. Remember, your life is yours to decide.